Okay, to take some questions? Plenty of time. Sure. Okay.
We have plenty of time for questions, and we have a microphone because people sitting in the back can't be heard in the front. So wait for the mic when you are ready to ask a question.
Not a question, a request. Towards the end of your talk, you were speaking about the current state of care and essentially society dealing with mental illness and the mentally ill. Could you say a few words about the history of that, and in particular the revolution from institutionalization to deinstitutionalization?
Sure. So the change in the 60s was to empty the state mental health mental hospitals, and through most of really from the 1850s or so, when Pinnell said, let's get people out of prisons and make sure that they get care. That happened. They ended up going into large state institutions. In 1960, there were 660,000 people in state hospital systems. Today, there are less than 60,000. So those state hospitals were closed, and sometimes for very good reasons. Sometimes the care wasn't very good. The plan originally in the Kennedy administration, and it evolved from there under Johnson and others, was to create a network of of local community mental health resources. When I was in training in the early 70s, mid-70s, we had that, and it was a pretty good system, actually. It wasn't perfect, but I think we did okay by people with these illnesses. They did go into state hospital for maybe a few days at a time. When they get ill, they'd get back on medication, and they'd come back into something based in the community. I was in a small town in western Massachusetts, and we knew families, they knew us, and it was a lifelong commitment. That's really been shredded in the last 2 to 3 decades. We just don't have that kind of system of care that we once had. And one might have hoped that that could be replaced by a robust insurance system that would allow people to sort of navigate this themselves. Not so much. So we really, I think, are in search of what is going to be the next right model for people with these illnesses, and how that gets integrated with their general medical care will be extremely important. The last thing I'll say is that in 2010, just a year ago today, the Mental Health Parity Act became, Mental Health Parity, the law, was put into place. And that does require that any insurance system that covers physical health, as it's called, has to cover mental health. If it covers it at all, has to cover it at the same level, with the same co-pays and the same constraints. That helps, but we haven't yet figured out how to implement that. And one of the things we worry most is that those providers or those insurance companies will decide that the best way to deal with this is to not provide any care for mental health, because you don't have to show parity unless you're providing some. And so we're still watching and waiting to see how this plays out. But particularly now, as budgets are so tight in state systems, and insurance companies are really feeling this pinch as well, we're not sure that it's going to get any better. It might get much worse.
I apologize for the preamble, the long preamble. Harold Varmus and Michael Bishop got the Nobel Prize for basically discovering that we are our own cancer, that it exists. It is, as Pogo said, we have met the enemy and he is us. I wonder if there has been any research or any thought to finding a genetic seed for some kind of, or a genetic process, I guess, more than a seed, to decide how a gene, which we all have, can go awry, can metastasize, do something weird in terms of mental illness as it does in cancer?
Well, so probably if there's one area that we've invested most in the last 4 or 5 years at NIMH, it's been in the genetics of mental illness because of the twin data and family data that said there's got to be a signal there. And like everybody else in the rest of medicine, we chased what are called the common variants that were found, and many of which are associated with cancer. Then we didn't do so well. And yet a funny thing happened on the way to that project, which was we discovered that there aren't only common variations in gene sequence, but there are rare structural changes in the genome, which we didn't really know much about. I mean, we knew some of them, but we knew very little about the diversity of them. The ones that we ended up discovering about 3 years ago were called copy number variants. They're areas of the genome for a bunch of structural reasons, where a whole section, maybe 1 million bases of DNA will get duplicated or quadruplicated. And sometimes they get deleted. Sometimes it occurs in a duplicate and one of them drops out. And who knew? But it turns out that those rare but real structural variations in the genome are about 10 times more frequent in people with schizophrenia and people with autism. And here's the kicker. They're not found in the parents. So many cases of these are what we call de novo mutations. They're mutations that probably occur, particularly in autism, because they're transmitted by an older dad who's had lots, because you're born with the number of eggs you're always going to have. Those don't change. But your sperm continue to reproduce through the lifespan, and by the time you're in your 40s, you've had about 35 to 50, depending, reproductive events. And these are probably collected over time. And so it is the case that children with autism, or I should say fathers over 40 have about a 6-fold higher risk of having a kid with autism. And these specific kinds of rare mutations may be part of what's driving this. Now, how those mutations cause the disease, we still don't know.
Thank you for a very illuminating presentation. You mentioned that we have new tools now, and I was wondering if you might tell me which of the mental illnesses look like they are being understood or that will be understood so that they'll either have better medication for stabilization or even a cure.
Yeah, it's a great question. Probably the place where we've made the most advances in terms of going from really basic science to treatments is in the area of the anxiety disorders. We actually know we have, it's an area that we've really mapped out in elegant detail, both at a molecular and a cellular and a systems level. We've got the landscape of this. But the reality is that the treatments were already pretty good anyway. And ironically, the treatments that seem to work best in this case are behavioral, not necessarily medications. These cognitive behavior therapies, the kind of exposure therapy that George mentioned, these are extremely powerful and ones that have a very, very high success rate. The areas where we're most or pushing the hardest right now are in areas of severe depression, where we've also think that by understanding the circuitry, we may be able to identify new targets. Some of those could be for medications, but oddly enough, probably the most exciting new development is around using deep brain stimulation, just as we do in Parkinson's, for people who don't respond to medications in depression, and that seems to be quite helpful. And schizophrenia and autism are two other areas where we have a lot of exciting work going on. In schizophrenia, I think, and actually in both of those, the genetics is moving very quickly, and we're trying to use the genetics to help us to identify where the next generation of medications could come from. I think we've just about hit the wall on the current medications. We're not, there's been really no new discoveries of medications, as far as I'm concerned, in about 3 decades. Everything has been kind of a iterative Me Too med since then. What we need is the next new thing, the next really important idea that's much, much better than what we have now. And we're not quite there, but I think that's probably the next 4 or 5 years, is identifying that.